The wind came down off the Cascades that October morning, the way it always did in the Willamette Valley. Slow, deliberate, carrying the scent of wet cedar and something older, something like memory. Margaret Ellsworth stood on the porch of the farmhouse her husband had built with his own 2 hands 46 years ago. A chipped enamel mug of black coffee cradled between her palms, and watched the mist lift off the southern slope of her land the way a curtain lifts off a stage. She was 72 years old. Her back was straight as a fence post. Her hair, once the color of autumn wheat, had gone the silver of riverstone, and she wore it pinned up under a wide-brimmed canvas hat that had belonged to Walter. The hat still smelled faintly of him, even after 4 years of pipe tobacco and orchard sap and the particular sweetness of a man who had spent his whole life with his hands in the dirt. Maggie took a slow sip of her coffee and let her eyes travel across the 40 acres that stretched out before her. The Heritage Block sat on the southern slope, 12 acres of the most valuable botanical inheritance west of the Mississippi, though most folks in Marion County wouldn't have recognized its worth if you'd laid it out on a silver platter. To the casual eye, it looked like nothing more than an old orchard, gnarled trunks thick as oil barrels. Branches twisted by decades of prevailing wind leaves already gone gold and copper with the coming frost. But Maggie knew what those trees really were. Walter had known too. And now, at the tail end of a season that had produced the finest crop of Ellsworth crimson apples in the orchard's entire history, she was the last living witness to what her husband had built. She lifted the mug to her lips again and thought, as she always thought this time of year, about the day Walter had first shown her the seedling, 1993. A drizzling Tuesday in April. He had been out in the grafting shed since before dawn, and when he came up to the house for breakfast, his eyes had that particular quiet fire in them. The fire that meant he had finally cracked something he had been working on for years. He set down a small clay pot on the kitchen table between them, and inside the pot was nothing more than a thin green whip of a stem no thicker than a pencil with 3 tiny serrated leaves at the top. "Maggie," he had said in that soft, careful voice of his, "I think I've done it." He had been crossing hardy century-old rootstock with a rare late-blooming cider apple from a monastery orchard in the Loire Valley for 19 years. 19 years of failed grafts and killed seedlings and root rot and false starts. 19 years of Walter Ellsworth quietly refusing to give up on an idea that most modern agricultural universities would have dismissed as a hobbyist's daydream. But there it had been on the kitchen table. A whip of green no bigger than a soda straw. The first true Ellsworth crimson. She had leaned across the table and kissed him on the mouth without saying a word. Now, 30 years later, that seedling had become 110 mature trees on the southern slope, each one bearing fruit so dark it looked almost black in the shadow of its own leaves, so complex in its tannin profile that boutique cider makers up in Seattle and Portland spoke about it in the hushed, reverent tones that other men reserved for rare vintages of Bordeaux. Walter had never lived to see the harvest of his life's work reach that particular status. He had died in the driveway on a July afternoon 4 years ago, a 50-cent garden hose still curled in his left hand, his straw hat lying crowned down in the gravel beside him, his heart having simply stopped without ceremony or warning. Maggie had found him there when she came back from the co-op in Silverton with a bag of chicken feed and a jar of blackberry preserves. She had knelt beside him in the driveway for a very long time before she called anyone. She had held his hand until it went cold, and she had told him quietly, the way a woman tells a man something important when she knows he can still hear her, that she would not let his trees go, that she would carry the work forward, that the orchard would stand. She had kept that promise for 4 years. She meant to keep it for whatever years she had left. The screen door creaked behind her, and Maggie didn't need to turn to know it was no one, just the wind. But she turned anyway, the way you turn when you spend enough seasons alone in a house that used to hold 2 people. The kitchen behind her was warm from the cast-iron stove. A copper kettle was starting to whistle. On the wall above the sink, in a plain wooden frame, hung a photograph of Walter at the age of 58, standing beside the very first Ellsworth crimson to bear a full harvest, his hand resting on the trunk the way another man might rest his hand on his son's shoulder. Maggie went back inside and turned the burner off. It was Tuesday, October 3rd. In a little over 3 weeks, on the 24th, she had a cardiology appointment in Portland that could not be missed. Her doctor had been very particular about that. A stress echocardiogram, a follow-up on the atrial fibrillation that had been announcing itself in her chest for the past year in soft, irregular flutters, like a moth trapped behind her breastbone. 6 hours off the property minimum, once you counted the drive. She had already made a note in the calendar hanging by the pantry door. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at that calendar for a long moment without knowing exactly why. Something about the day already marked out felt like a warning. She could not have said what. She was 72 years old, and she had learned over a long life to listen to that particular kind of quiet unease. But she put the feeling aside and went out to the shed to sharpen her pruning shears. The trouble had started, if she were being honest with herself, 3 months after Walter's funeral. A man named Preston Vane had come up the gravel drive in a black luxury SUV with tinted windows and Portland plates. He was 45 years old and wore an Italian suit that had cost more than Maggie's tractor, and he had a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He introduced himself as the Senior Acquisitions Director for Vane and Ridgway Holdings out of Portland, a name that meant nothing to Maggie at the time but would come to mean a great deal in the seasons that followed. Preston had wanted to talk about the land. Vane and Ridgway had recently acquired 300 acres of former dairy pasture that ring the Ellsworth farm on 3 sides. Their plan, Preston explained with the enthusiasm of a man selling a religion, was to build a luxury subdivision called the Estates at Oak Haven. Faux farmhouse mansions on 2-acre lots. A private golf course carved out of the low ground by the creek. Paved walking trails winding through what would remain of the native oak savanna. It was going to be, Preston said, a jewel of the Willamette Valley. There was, he said, only one small problem. Maggie's 40 acres sat directly in the middle of what Preston called Phase 3. She had told him that first day that the farm was not for sale. She had told him politely. She had offered him coffee. She had not invited him into the house, but she had spoken to him from the porch, the way you speak to any stranger who has driven a long way for nothing, with the courtesy her mother had taught her back in the 60s, and the firmness she had learned from 40 years of dealing with cattle and men. Preston had left that day with his smile still intact, but Maggie had watched his SUV disappear down the gravel drive, and she had known in the same quiet way she had known that morning about the calendar that the man would be back. He came back 4 times over the next 3 years. The offers went up. 800,000, 1.2 million, 1.8 million. And this past July, sitting across from her at the kitchen table because she had finally foolishly let him inside, $2.5 million in cash wire transferred within 72 hours of her signature, with a private moving service included. Maggie had listened to him with her hands folded on the oilcloth. When he was done, she had stood up, walked over to the stove and poured herself a fresh cup of coffee without offering him one. "Mr. Vane," she had said, her back still turned to him. "My husband's ashes are scattered under the grand oak by the creek. Every tree on that southern slope was grafted by his hands. This farm is not a puzzle piece, and it is most certainly not for sale." Preston's voice had gone flat. "Mrs. Ellsworth, you are an elderly woman living alone on 40 acres you cannot possibly work by yourself. Property taxes are going to climb. The urban growth boundary is going to shift. You are holding back progress for the sake of nostalgia. Take the money, Mrs. Ellsworth. Take it before the situation becomes difficult." Maggie had turned around then, and she had looked at him across her own kitchen the way a woman looks at a snake she has just found coiled on her hearth. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Vane?" "I'm offering you friendly financial advice." He had left the house without finishing his coffee. He had left his business card face down on the table. Maggie had waited until his SUV was out of sight, and then she had picked up the card between her thumb and forefinger, walked over to the wood stove, opened the iron door and dropped it in. She had stood there and watched it burn. That was July. By August, the trouble had begun in earnest. The first thing was the water. Someone at the county Maggie never did learn exactly who had approved a rerouting of the old McKinney drainage canal, the one that had carried spring melt off the higher ground east of her property for the better part of a century. Within a week of the new pipes going in, a section of her northern pasture had become a shallow lake. Two of her ewes had lost their footing in the mud and had to be pulled out by a neighbor's boy with a length of tow strap. She lost half a ton of second-cutting hay to standing water. Then came the noise complaints. Anonymous calls to the Marion County Sheriff's Dispatch 3 or 4 a week reporting that Mrs. Ellsworth had been running heavy equipment before 6 in the morning, in violation of some ordinance that did not, as it turned out, actually apply to working agricultural properties in that zoning district. Maggie had made that clear to the young deputies who came out to her farm, and to their credit, most of them had been embarrassed to be there at all. But the calls kept coming. Then came the fence. Vane and Ridgway had put up a 15-foot chain-link security fence with green privacy mesh along the entire western and southern boundary of Maggie's property, ostensibly to protect their construction equipment. The mesh choked off her view of the low hills. The fence hummed in the wind at a low, unpleasant frequency that carried through the walls of the farmhouse at night. Diesel exhaust from the graders parked on the far side drifted across the property line and hung in the still morning air like a chemical fog. Maggie did not break. She hired a licensed surveyor out of Salem, a woman named Lorraine Whitaker, to walk the property line with her and reflag every corner, every witness monument, every original 1912 iron pin. She drove to the county assessor's office in person and pulled certified copies of the original deed, the subsequent amendments, the water rights, and every recorded easement going back to 1889. She kept the originals in a fireproof strongbox in the pantry. She kept certified copies in a safety deposit box at the credit union in Silverton. She kept a third set of copies in a sealed envelope at the office of an attorney in Portland, whose name Walter had once mentioned to her in passing on a summer evening she could barely remember. She continued to run her tractor when she pleased. She continued to tend to the heritage block. And in the last week of August, a courier delivered an envelope to her mailbox from a company called Cascade Craft Cider up in Seattle, containing a preliminary purchase agreement for the entire Ellsworth Crimson Harvest, every apple for the next 10 consecutive seasons, at a price that made Maggie sit down at the kitchen table and read the letter 3 times. $380,000 a year, for 10 years. She had folded the letter carefully and placed it inside Walter's old orchard ledger, where he had recorded every graft, every rootstock, every failed and successful cross for 40 years. She had run her thumb along the edge of the leather binding, and she had said out loud to no one, "Walter, we did it." We did. But even as she said it, she could hear the low hum of the security fence in the distance, and she knew the way a woman who has lived 72 years on the same piece of ground knows that Preston Vane was not going to let her have this without a fight. It was on the second Sunday in October that Maggie found the box. She had gone up into the attic for reasons she couldn't afterward quite remember. Something about looking for a wool blanket to put on the guest bed against the coming cold. She had climbed the pull-down ladder with the caution of a woman who knew her hip could not afford another fall, and she had switched on the bare overhead bulb, and she had stood for a moment among the dust-furred boxes and canvas-covered furniture of 46 years of shared life. The box was tucked against the north gable wall behind a stack of Walter's old agricultural journals. It was cedar, about the size of a small toolbox. Walter had built it himself. She recognized his dovetail joinery the moment she saw it tight and clean as a promise. There was a small brass padlock on the front. She had never seen the box before in her life. Maggie stood in the dim attic for a long time looking at it. Then she carried it carefully down the ladder into the kitchen and set it on the oilcloth. She fetched Walter's old key ring from the hook by the back door, a heavy iron ring with maybe 40 keys on it, most of which she had never identified, and she began one by one to try them in the little brass padlock. The 17th key turned. Inside the box, resting on a folded square of green flannel, was a manila envelope. And inside the envelope were 3 documents and a letter. The first document was a certificate of registration dated 15 years earlier from the National Clonal Germplasm Repository of the United States Department of Agriculture. The certificate identified a proprietary apple cultivar registered under the name Ellsworth Crimson and named Walter Franklin Ellsworth as the originating breeder of record. The certificate bore a raised federal seal. The second document was a contract 7 pages long between Walter Ellsworth and the Agricultural Research Service of the USDA, executed 9 years ago. The contract designated the 12-acre southern block of the Ellsworth farm as a critical agricultural biodiversity site under federal protection, and it specifically referenced the Plant Variety Protection Act. The third document was an appraisal dated 6 years ago from a firm called Ashcombe and Kerrigan Botanical Consulting based in Ithaca, New York. It valued the heritage block as an intact and functioning genetic bank at just over $4.6 million. Maggie sat down in the kitchen chair. She reached without looking for the letter. It was in Walter's handwriting. The paper was slightly yellowed. It was dated the March before he died. My Maggie. It began. If you are reading this letter, it means that I am gone. And it means that something on the farm has gone wrong enough that you have finally gotten curious about the old box in the attic. I am sorry to have kept a secret from you. I did it because I knew you would tell me it was too much fuss, and I wanted the fuss done quietly. The crimson is not just an apple, Maggie. It is a registered federal cultivar. The southern block is not just an orchard. It is a protected biodiversity site. If anyone ever tries to take that land from you or damages those trees, they will not be dealing with a widow and a woodlot. They will be dealing with the United States Department of Agriculture and every statute Congress has ever passed to protect a plant patent. Take these papers to a man named Merritt Ainsworth in Portland. He is an agricultural attorney. He is old and slow and thorough, and he does not lose. Tell him you are Walter Ellsworth's wife. He will do the rest. I love you more than the trees, Maggie. But the trees are the second thing. Walter. Maggie read the letter 3 times, then she folded it very carefully along its original creases, put it back inside the envelope, put the envelope back inside the cedar box, and closed the lid. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time without moving. Outside the window, the light had begun to go golden the way it did in early October, and a flock of sandhill cranes passed high overhead, calling to each other in that ancient wooden voice of theirs on their long, slow way south. When she finally stood up, her knees were stiff and her hands were shaking, but not from fear. From something much older than fear. That evening, Silas Thornwood came up the drive. Silas was 76 years old, a retired federal ranger who had worked 40 years in the national forests of eastern Oregon before he had bought a cabin on 20 acres just north of the Ellsworth place and settled in to grow old among the pines. He had been Walter's oldest friend. He had been at the funeral. He had helped Maggie load the last of Walter's tools into the equipment shed and lock the door behind them without saying much of anything, which was Maggie had understood then, and understood now, the exact right thing for him to have done. He drove an old Ford F-25 of the color of rust and river silt. And when he stepped down out of the cab that evening, he was carrying a paper bag with the neck of a bottle of bullet bourbon sticking out of the top. Maggie met him on the porch. Silas. Maggie. He did not smile. Silas Thornwood almost never smiled, but he tilted his head at her the way he always did when he had come with news that he did not particularly want to share, and Maggie stepped aside without a word to let him into the kitchen. She fetched 2 glasses. He poured. They sat down at the oilcloth-covered table with the cedar box between them, though Silas did not ask about the box and Maggie did not offer. He took a long, slow sip of the bourbon and set the glass down carefully. I saw something last night, Maggie, down at the Silver Anchor in Salem. The Silver Anchor was a bar, a working man's bar with cheap beer and a jukebox that had not been updated since the second Bush administration. Silas went there once a week to play pool with a group of retired county employees. I saw Preston Vane. Sitting in the back booth, he was with a man I recognized. Fella named Delbert Cranmer, county drainage inspector, the one who approved the McKinney Canal rerouting last summer. Maggie set her own glass down. Preston slid an envelope across the table, Maggie. Cranmer took it and put it inside his coat. I watched the whole thing. She did not speak. Silas took another slow sip. There's more. I stayed for a while. Cranmer went home. Preston stayed. Around 10 o'clock, a second man came in. Big fella, expensive coat, sat down across from Preston and did most of the talking. I didn't recognize him at the time, but I asked the bartender on my way out. Bartender knew him. Name is Harlan Ridgway, co-chairman of Vane and Ridgway Holdings. Maggie was very still. Ridgway told Preston, and I heard this clear enough because I was 2 booths away, pretending to read the sports page. Ridgway told Preston that the investors were losing patience. Said the bank was watching. Said, and these were his exact words, Maggie said, "I don't care how you get that old woman off that land. I want that southern block cleared before the end of the month." He set the glass down. He did not look at her. "I thought you ought to know." Maggie sat with her hands folded on the oilcloth for a long moment. Then she reached across the table, opened a drawer beneath the edge, and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. She flipped past several pages of grocery lists and pruning schedules until she found a fresh page, and she picked up the pencil she kept clipped to the spine. She wrote in her careful schoolteacher's hand, October 15th. Silas Thornwood observed Preston Vane and Delbert Cranmer at Silver Anchor Tavern, Salem. Envelope exchanged. Same evening, Vane met with Harlan Ridgway. Ridgway instructed Vane to clear the southern block before month's end. She closed the notebook. She looked up at Silas. "Thank you, Silas." He nodded once. He finished his bourbon. He set the glass down very gently, as if it were made of something fragile. "You keep that shotgun of Walter's loaded, Maggie." "I will. And you call me if you hear anything at night." "Anything at all?" "I will." He stood, put on his hat, and walked out to his truck. She stood on the porch and watched his taillights disappear down the gravel drive. Then she went back inside and picked up the calendar that hung by the pantry door. She looked at the date circled in red. October 24th, Portland. Cardiology, 6 hours off the property minimum once you counted the drive. She stood there for a long time in the yellow kitchen light with the calendar in her hand and the sound of the wind moving through the eaves of the old farmhouse, and she understood with a clarity as cold and sharp as a pruning blade that Preston Vane had also been looking at that calendar, that he had known about the appointment, that he had been waiting for it, that he had marked it out on some calendar of his own weeks ago in an office overlooking a construction site with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. 9 days. She put the calendar back on its hook. She went to the front room and took Walter's Winchester down from above the mantel. She checked the chamber. She loaded it with fresh shells from the drawer in the sideboard, 5 in the magazine, 1 in the pipe, and she leaned it in the corner by the front door where she could reach it without thinking. She poured herself a small measure of the bourbon Silas had left behind. She sat down in Walter's chair by the wood stove, and she raised the glass toward the photograph above the sink. Walter, at 58, his hand on the trunk of the first crimson tree, and she said very quietly, "You planned for this, didn't you, old man?" She drank. She sat for a long time in the ticking silence of the house, and outside the wind kept moving down off the mountains, the way it always did in October, carrying the scent of wet cedar and old snow. And somewhere out beyond the fence line, the diesel graders of Vane and Ridgway Holdings sat cooling in the dark. And somewhere in Portland, Preston Vane was studying a topographical map of the southern block. And Maggie Ellsworth, 72 years old, her spine as straight as a fence post, her hands calloused from 4 decades of pruning shears, sat in her kitchen and made a list in the leather notebook of every single thing she was going to do in the next 9 days. The list ran to 3 pages. At the bottom of the 3rd page, she wrote a single line underlined, "Twice Merritt Ainsworth." Portland, first thing Monday morning. She closed the notebook. She banked the fire in the stove. She turned off the kitchen light. And in the dark, alone on 40 acres of the finest orchard land in the Willamette Valley, Margaret Ellsworth went to bed like a woman who had finally understood exactly what kind of fight was coming for her, and exactly who her husband had been in the long, quiet years before he died, when he had sat at this same kitchen table with a manila envelope and a cedar box and a pencil, and had built her a shield out of federal law that she was only now 4 years too late to thank him for it beginning to hold in her own 2 hands. Outside, the wind moved through the branches of the heritage block. The leaves whispered. The trees, for one more night, still stood. The morning of October the 24th came in cold and clear, with a hard blue sky over the valley, and a frost so heavy on the pasture grass that it looked from the kitchen window as if someone had laid a coarse white sheet across the whole of the northern field. Maggie Ellsworth stood at that window with her hands wrapped around a fresh mug of coffee and watched the light come up over the ridge. She had been awake since 4. She had not slept well in 9 days. The list in the leather notebook had grown to 7 pages, and she had crossed off every item on the first 6. She had gone to Portland the Monday after Silas Thornwood's visit, and she had sat across a scarred oak desk from Merritt Ainsworth, 68 years old, silver-haired, slow-eyed, wearing a wool cardigan over a rumpled dress shirt. She had laid the cedar box on the desk between them, and she had watched him open it. She had watched him read the letter Walter had written. She had watched a long, slow smile spread across his weathered face, the smile of a man who had been waiting his entire career for exactly this kind of file to land on his desk. "Mrs. Ellsworth," Merritt had said, tapping the federal registration certificate with one finger. "Your husband was a man who thought several moves ahead." He was. "You understand what this is?" "I do now." Merritt had nodded once, and then he had told her in his slow, careful way about a statute of the state of Oregon called ORS 105.810. He had explained that in the state of Oregon, if a person willfully and maliciously cut down or damaged the trees of another, the injured party was entitled not merely to the value of the trees, but to treble damages 3 times the value mandated by the court, no discretion, no negotiation. It was an old statute. It went back to the logging days. It had been written by legislators who understood exactly what a stand of timber was worth to the man who had raised it. "But Mrs. Ellsworth," Merritt had said, and here he had leaned across the desk and looked at her over the tops of his reading glasses. "The treble multiplier applies only if we can prove the trespass was willful, not accidental, not the result of a surveying error. If they claim a mapping mistake and we cannot prove otherwise, we recover only the base value, which is still substantial. But the multiplier is where the punishment lives. How do we prove willful? Testimony, documentation, a paper trail, a witness willing to take the stand." Maggie had thought about that for a long moment, and then she had opened the leather notebook and turned it around so Merritt could read the entry she had made the night Silas had come to the house. She had watched him read it twice. She had watched his eyebrows lift very slightly the second time through. "Mrs. Ellsworth," he had said, and now the smile was entirely gone from his face. "If what your neighbor witnessed is accurate, and if he is willing to sign a sworn affidavit, then we do not merely have a civil case. We may have the foundation of a federal corruption inquiry." "He'll sign." "You are certain?" "I have known Silas Thornwood for 40 years. He'll sign." Merritt had nodded once. He had reached for a legal pad, and for the next 3 hours he had asked her questions about Walter, about the orchard, about every contact she had ever had with Preston Vane, about the drainage canal, about the noise complaints, about the fence. Maggie had answered every one of them from the leather notebook. Merritt had written it all down. At the end of the 3 hours, he had looked at her across the desk, and he had said quietly, "Mrs. Ellsworth, I need to give you some advice, and I want you to hear it carefully. From this moment forward, you must assume that everything you say on your telephone is being listened to. Everything you send by email is being read. Every time you leave the property, someone is watching who is coming and going. Do not deviate from your routines. Do not skip your medical appointment. Do not let them see that you are preparing. Live your life exactly as you have been living it. And in the meantime, we will build a wall of evidence around that orchard that no bulldozer in the state of Oregon can knock down." She had done exactly what he had told her. For 9 days she had lived like a woman who was doing nothing at all. She had gone to church on Sunday. She had bought groceries at the co-op. She had pruned the winter cover in the raised beds behind the house. She had left the shotgun leaning in the corner by the front door, and she had not touched it, though she had checked the chamber every night before bed. And now it was October 24th. The frost was on the pasture. Her cardiology appointment was at 11. She would be off the property from 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon minimum. She finished her coffee. She rinsed the mug in the sink. She put on Walter's canvas hat and the wool coat Silas had given her for her 70th birthday, and she walked out to the pickup truck. She did not look at the southern block as she drove down the gravel drive. She could not bear to. The bulldozers came at 9:23. Boyd Grigsby, 52 years old, sat in the cab of the lead D9, with a paper coffee cup wedged into the console and a topographical map spread across his knees. The map had been handed to him at 7 that morning by Preston Vane himself in the parking lot of the Vane and Ridgeway field office, along with an envelope containing $5,000 in cash and the promise of $45,000 more wire transferred by the end of the week. Boyd had run heavy equipment for 31 years. He had cleared land from the Coast Range to the Blue Mountains. He knew what a legitimate boundary line looked like, and he knew what a doctored map looked like, and the map Preston had handed him that morning was unmistakably the second thing. He had said so. He had stood there in the gravel parking lot with the map in his hand, and he had looked Preston Vane in the face, and he had said, "Mr. Vane, the stakes on the ground don't match this. The Ellsworth line runs 250 feet north of where you got it drawn." Preston had smiled the smile that never reached his eyes. "The stakes are wrong, Boyd. There was a surveying error in the original 1912 filing. We've had it corrected. The corrected map is the one you're holding. I've been on that ground. There's a witness monument set in concrete at the northeast corner. That monument is old, older than either of us. It doesn't lie. Boyd, I'm not asking you to interpret a map. I am asking you to clear 12 acres of scrub apple wood. If you cannot do that, I will find another subcontractor who can. And by the way, the rate is doubled for today. $50,000 wire transferred by Friday. You have 3 children in the house, if I recall. One of them starting at Oregon State next fall." Boyd had stood there in the parking lot for a long moment. He had thought about his wife. He had thought about the mortgage. He had thought about the tuition bill that had come in the mail the week before and the new transmission the F350 was going to need before the first snow. He had thought about a great many things that a man thinks about at 52 years old when he is being handed $50,000 to look the other way. And then he had folded the map and he had put it in the cab of the D9, and he had told his crew to load up. Now he sat in the cab of the lead dozer at the northern edge of the heritage block with the sun just clearing the ridge behind him, and he watched the 12 acres of ancient twisted apple trees glow in the morning light, like something out of a painting from before the wars. The trunks were thick as oil barrels. The leaves were the color of copper and old gold. The fruit, dark red almost to black, hung heavy on the branches, and even from 100 yards away, Boyd could smell the sweet fermenting scent of the windfalls in the grass beneath. He sat there for a full 60 seconds with his hand on the throttle. Then he pushed it forward, and the D9 rolled onto the southern block. The first tree came down at 9:41. It was an Ellsworth crimson 43 feet tall, its trunk 2.5 feet in diameter at the base. The steel jaws of the excavator closed around it just above the graft union, and the century-old rootstock gave way with a sound like a rifle shot. The canopy, heavy with ripe fruit, crashed to the earth in a slow, terrible arc, and the apples burst against the tracks of the machines in a shower of red pulp and clear sweet juice that ran into the black soil and pooled there. Boyd looked away. He did not look back at the trees again for the next 3 hours and 40 minutes. He looked at the topographical map. He looked at the fuel gauges. He looked at the sky. He looked at the tin of chewing tobacco on the console. He looked at anything at all except at the destruction his machines were carrying out on the 12 acres of ground that Walter Ellsworth had spent 30 years of his life building. By 1:15 in the afternoon, it was over. 110 Ellsworth crimson trees, 14 Arkansas blacks, 22 Huey's crabs, whose lineage traced back through documented graftings to George Washington's own orchards at Mount Vernon. Every single one uprooted root system torn from the earth piled in massive tangled heaps at the center of what had once been the finest heritage orchard west of the Mississippi. The metal identification tags that Walter had wired to the branches, each one bearing a hand-stamped serial number that corresponded to an entry in his ledger, were ground into the mud beneath the tracks of the dozers. The 12 acres were a wasteland. Boyd Grigsby shut down the D9. He climbed down out of the cab. He stood in the churned black soil with the diesel-choked air burning in his lungs. And he looked at what he had done, and he understood in that moment that he was going to remember this day for the rest of his life, and that there was no amount of money in the state of Oregon that was going to change that. Half a mile north on the porch of a modest ranch house with 3/4 horses in the paddock behind it, Delphine Fairbanks had been watching through binoculars since 9:45. She had heard the machine start up, and she had gone out onto the porch with her coffee, and she had raised the binoculars, and she had watched the first D9 roll onto Maggie Ellsworth's southern block, and she had said out loud to no one, "Oh, my dear God." She had gone inside. She had picked up her phone. She had held it in her hand for a long moment, frozen. And then she had done the smartest thing she would do in her 71 years of life on that farm. She had opened the camera app. She had gone back onto the porch. She had zoomed the lens in as far as it would go. And she had recorded in high definition 47 separate video clips spanning 3 hours and 40 minutes, capturing every dozer, every excavator, every falling tree, and every man walking the perimeter, including a black luxury SUV that pulled up to the fence line at 12:15 and disgorged a man in an Italian suit who stood with his hands on his hips and watched the last of the Ellsworth crimson trees come down, with what Delphine, watching through the binoculars, could only describe as an expression of profound satisfaction. At 1:17, Delphine called Maggie. Maggie was pulling into the parking lot of the cardiology clinic in Portland when the phone rang. She had a moment of confusion when she saw Delphine's name on the screen. Delphine did not call her often, and never during the day. And then she picked up, and she heard the tone in Delphine's voice, and she knew. She knew before Delphine said a single word. "Maggie," Delphine said, and her voice was shaking. "Maggie, honey, they're on your land. The machines, they've torn down the whole southern slope. I've been recording the whole time." Maggie sat in the parking lot with the phone pressed to her ear, and the engine idling, and for the space of 4 long breaths she could not speak. Then she said very calmly, "Delphine, don't stop recording. Not until they leave. Do you understand?" "I understand." "And Delphine, thank you." She hung up. She sat in the parking lot for another 30 seconds. Her hands were on the steering wheel. Her heart was beating in that soft, irregular flutter, the moth behind her breastbone. She thought about her doctor. She thought about the stress echocardiogram scheduled for 11:22. She thought about Walter, and about the letter in the cedar box, and about the promise she had made in the driveway 4 years ago with his cold hand in hers. Then she put the truck in gear, backed out of the parking space, and drove south on Interstate 5 at exactly the speed limit, because she was not going to give Preston Vane or the Oregon State Police or anyone else the satisfaction of catching her doing one single thing wrong on the day her husband's life's work was murdered. She arrived at the farm at 2:49 in the afternoon. Delphine was standing at the property line with her phone still recording. She lowered it when she saw Maggie's truck coming up the drive, and she stepped back, and she let Maggie pass without a word because there was nothing in the English language that Delphine Fairbanks was going to say in that moment that would help. Maggie parked the truck at the top of the ridge overlooking the southern block. She got out. She walked to the edge of the ridge and she looked down. For a long moment, she did not react. She simply stood there, a small figure in a canvas hat against the vast blue Oregon sky, and she looked at the 12 acres of torn earth where 46 years of her marriage had lived. The trees were piled in the center of the field like corpses. The soil was churned and black and glistening with crushed fruit. The morning frost had long since melted, and steam rose from the exposed earth in slow curling wisps that caught the afternoon light. Then her knees gave out. She went down into the soil at the edge of the ridge. She caught herself on her hands. She knelt there in the wet black earth, and she took a fistful of it in each hand, and she began to weep. Not loudly. Not the way a younger woman weeps, but with the deep, silent, racking grief of a woman who had already buried a husband once and was now, 4 years later, being made to bury him a second time. She wept for perhaps 2 minutes. And then she saw protruding from the edge of the nearest slash pile a broken branch of an Ellsworth crimson with a small metal tag still wired to it. The tag was stamped with a serial number, and beneath the serial number in letters small enough that she had to lean forward to read them the words NCGR-USD-AREG. Something changed in her face. It was not a slow change. It was the kind of change that happens in a fraction of a second, the way a sky changes color at the exact moment before a thunderstorm breaks. The grief drained out of her eyes, and something else came in, something older and colder and much, much harder. She wiped her hands on her jeans. She stood up. She was still standing there, dry-eyed, when she heard the sound of an engine coming up the gravel drive behind her, and she turned and she saw the black luxury SUV of Preston Vane rolling slowly toward her across the flattened earth of the southern block. He got out of the vehicle. He walked toward her with his hands raised in what she assumed he thought was a gesture of concern. He was flanked by Boyd Grigsby, who would not look at her, and by a second man Maggie did not recognize, a younger fellow with a clipboard and a pinched apologetic face. Preston stopped 10 feet away. "Mrs. Ellsworth," he began in a voice of exaggerated regret, "this is a terrible, terrible misunderstanding." Maggie said nothing. "There appears to have been a catastrophic error with the surveyor's maps. My subcontractor here crossed the boundary line by mistake. I am absolutely sick about this, Mrs. Ellsworth. Truly." He reached into the inert pocket of his suit jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. "I know these trees had sentimental value, but legally, agricultural timber is valued by the cord for firewood purposes. My assessor has run the numbers on standard apple wood. I am prepared to offer you $15,000 for the loss of the timber plus reseeding costs for the pasture grass. Consider it a generous apology for an honest mistake." He held the check out toward her. He was smiling. It was a small smile. The corner of his mouth, almost imperceptible. He thought he had won. The obstacle was gone. The pipes could be laid. The penalty was pocket change for a multi-billion-dollar development portfolio. The old woman would cry, would take the check, would eventually sell the rest of the land at a discount, and by Thanksgiving, the Phase 3 foundations would be pouring. He thought this. He was wrong. Maggie looked at the check. Then she looked past it, past Preston Vane at the broken branch with the metal tag still wired to it. And she said in a voice that was as quiet and as level as a plumb line, "Mr. Vane, I want you to look at that branch." He did not look. "I said look at it." Something in her voice made him turn his head. "That tag," Maggie said, "is a National Clonal Germplasm Repository registration marker. Every tree on this slope wore one. The trees you have destroyed are a federally registered proprietary cultivar. The ground you are standing on is a critical agricultural biodiversity site under contract with the United States Department of Agriculture. And what you have done is not a boundary error. It is a federal offense." Preston's smile faltered, just for a second. Then he recovered, and the smooth voice came back, and he said, "Mrs. Ellsworth, I understand you are upset, but I think you are overstating the keep your check, Mr. Vane." She turned her back on him and began to walk toward her truck. "Mrs. Ellsworth, be reasonable. If you try to sue us, my attorneys will drag this out in civil court until you are dead. Take the $15,000. Take it and enjoy what years you have left." She stopped. She turned around slowly, and she looked at Preston Vane one last time across the 12 acres of murdered orchard. "You did not cut down firewood, Mr. Vane," she said. "You trespassed on private property and destroyed a federally registered proprietary botanical genetics bank. You are going to wish you had never heard the name Ellsworth." She got into her truck. She started the engine. She drove up the driveway to the farmhouse without looking back, and she left Preston Vane standing in the dirt with the check fluttering uselessly in his hand and the $15,000 written on it, suddenly feeling in a way he could not yet articulate like the smallest number he had ever offered anyone in his life. She was on the phone with Merritt Ainsworth before her boots came off in the mudroom. By 5 that afternoon, a copy of Delphine Fairbank's video files was on Merritt's desk in Portland via a courier that Merritt had personally dispatched the moment Maggie hung up the phone. By 6, Merritt had spoken to a federal investigator he had known for 20 years at the USDA regional office in Salem. By 7, Silas Thornwood had driven down from his cabin with a signed and notarized affidavit describing everything he had witnessed at the Silver Anchor Tavern on the night of October the 15th, and Maggie had sat with him at the kitchen table and poured him 3 fingers of the bullet, and neither one of them had said much because there was not much that needed saying. The next morning at 8 sharp, Merritt Ainsworth drove down from Portland himself and spent 5 hours in the farmhouse kitchen going through Walter's ledger page by page, cross-referencing each entry against the federal registration certificate. He photographed every document. He recorded every serial number. He took soil samples from the crushed root systems and sealed them in evidence bags. At one point, he looked up from the ledger. His reading glasses slid down to the end of his nose, and he said quietly, "Mrs. Ellsworth, I want to bring in Dr. Ashcombe." "Who is Dr. Ashcombe?" "Eleanor Ashcombe, forensic pomologist, Cornell University. She wrote the federal appraisal in your husband's box 6 years ago. She is the leading expert in the country on proprietary cultivar valuation. If she will come out here and produce a current appraisal of the loss, we will have a number that no defense attorney in the state of Oregon will be able to shake. Bring her. She charges $4,000 a day plus expenses. Bring her." Merritt nodded once and reached for his phone. Dr. Eleanor Ashcombe arrived from Ithaca on the 3rd of November. She was 55 years old, tall, gray-eyed, with the weathered hands of a woman who had spent 30 years in orchards on 4 continents. She wore heavy canvas work pants and a wool coat, and she spoke, when she spoke at all, in the clipped, precise vocabulary of a scientist who did not have time for imprecision. For 3 days she walked the destroyed heritage block with a clipboard and a set of calipers and a handheld GPS unit. She photographed every stump. She measured every root ball. She took cross-sections of the shattered trunks and counted the growth rings under a portable microscope. She interviewed Maggie for 4 hours in the farmhouse kitchen, and she interviewed Silas Thornwood for 2. And on the 2nd day of her work, Dr. Ashcombe made a discovery that would prove in ways none of them yet understood to be the seed of the orchard's resurrection. She found on the western edge of the destroyed block 3 living root fragments that had somehow escaped the passage of the machines, buried too deep, protected by a fold in the ground invisible to the operators. She had Maggie fetch clean burlap and moist peat. She wrapped the fragments herself. She had them in Maggie's greenhouse behind the farmhouse before the sun went down. "Mrs. Ellsworth," she said, standing in the doorway of the greenhouse in the gray November dusk, "if we care for these, we may yet save the cultivar." Maggie looked at the 3 small pieces of wood on the greenhouse bench. She did not weep. She had not wept since the afternoon at the edge of the ridge. But she nodded once, and she said, "Then we will care for them." On the evening of the 3rd day, Dr. Ashcombe sat down at the kitchen table across from Maggie and Merritt Ainsworth, and she opened a leather portfolio, and she read them her findings. The base valuation of a mature Ellsworth crimson tree, calculated on the replacement cost of the century-old rootstock, the intellectual property value of the proprietary graft, and the projected 20-year revenue stream from the existing cidery contract, is $42,000 per tree. Merritt did not blink. Maggie folded her hands on the oilcloth. "There are 110 Ellsworth crimson stumps on the site. 14 Arkansas blacks at a base valuation of $9,000 each. 22 Huey's crabs, which, given the documented Mount Vernon lineage, carry a substantial historical premium at $18,000 each. Add soil remediation, replanting infrastructure, and irrigation reconstruction, and the total documented loss comes to $4,812,000. She closed the portfolio. Under Oregon Revised Statute 100-5.810, if the trespass is found to be willful, the court will treble that figure. She looked across the table at Maggie. "Mrs. Ellsworth, the judgment against Vane and Ridgeway Holdings, if we can prove willful trespass, will exceed $14,400,000. Maggie sat very still. She looked down at her hands on the oilcloth. She looked at the photograph of Walter above the sink. Walter at 58, his hand on the trunk of the first crimson tree. She said very quietly, That will do. Dr. Ashcombe permitted herself one small nod. Merritt Ainsworth reached across the table and closed the leather notebook that had been open beside him, and he said, "I will file the complaint on Monday." He filed the complaint on Monday, November the 12th. At 2 in the afternoon that same day, a process server bypassed the receptionist at the Vane and Ridgway Portland office and walked directly into Preston Vane's corner suite, laid a 200-page legal filing on his glass desk, and left without saying a word. Preston picked up the document with the smile of a man who was expecting a nuisance suit for the $15,000 he had already offered. He flipped to the damages section. The color drained from his face in a way that his secretary, watching from the doorway, would later describe in a sworn deposition as like watching a fluorescent tube go out. He set the document down. He picked it up again. He read the number a second time. $14,400,000. He called Harlan Ridgway on the private line. Harlan Ridgway. 60 years old, sitting in a leather chair in his own office, 2 floors above Preston's, listened for exactly 45 seconds and then said in a voice as flat and cold as the surface of a frozen lake, "Preston, come upstairs, now." 2 nights later, at 11:47 in the evening, Maggie Ellsworth was reading in the front room of the farmhouse when the motion light over the driveway snapped on, and she heard faintly the sound of a vehicle idling at the top of the gravel drive with its headlights turned off. She set down her book. She reached for the Winchester leaning in the corner. She stood up, and she walked to the front window, and she pulled the curtain aside 2 inches, and she looked out. A dark pickup truck sat at the top of the drive. She could see the shape of a man in the driver's seat. She could not see his face. Beyond the truck at the property line, the beam of a second flashlight bobbed along the chain-link fence, and she saw, in the yellow driveway light, that a fresh gap had been cut in the mesh. Someone was walking through the gap toward the house. Maggie stepped back from the window. She picked up the phone from the side table with her free hand, without looking away from the front door, and she dialed Silas Thornwood's number. He picked up on the first ring. "Maggie. Silas, there's a man on my property, coming toward the house. I'll be there in 6 minutes. Bring the 12 gauge. I already got it." She hung up. She walked to the front door. She flipped on the porch light. She threw the deadbolt. She stepped back 3 paces, and she brought the Winchester up to her shoulder, and she stood in the middle of her own front room at 72 years old, with the stock of her husband's rifle against her cheek and a shell in the chamber. And she waited. The man on the porch was maybe 20 feet from the door when the porch light caught him. He was wearing a dark jacket and a ball cap pulled low. He stopped when the light hit him. He looked up at the door. He looked at the light. He looked at the door again. Then he saw through the front window the silhouette of a small, silver-haired woman standing in the middle of her front room with a rifle pointed steady at his center of mass. He turned around. He walked back down the porch steps. He walked back through the gap in the fence. The dark pickup at the top of the drive pulled away without ever turning on its headlights, and Maggie stood in her front room with the Winchester at her shoulder for another 6 full minutes until she heard the roar of Silas Thornwood's F-25. Oh, coming up the gravel drive at 50 miles an hour. And then she lowered the rifle, and she went to the door and she let him in, and neither one of them said anything at all for a long time. They sat at the kitchen table until dawn. At 6 in the morning, Maggie drove to the Marion County Sheriff's substation in Silverton and filed a written report of the trespass and the vandalism to the fence. The young deputy who took her report looked at her twice while she was writing it out, and when she was finished, he said quietly, "Mrs. Ellsworth, do you want us to send a car up to the property tonight?" "No, thank you, deputy. I have a friend staying with me." "Yes, ma'am." She drove home. That afternoon she called Merritt Ainsworth, and she told him about the man on the porch, and there was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then Merritt said in a voice she had not heard from him before, "Mrs. Ellsworth, they have moved from civil intimidation to criminal intimidation. This changes things. This changes things considerably." "What does it change?" "It changes what we do about the subcontractor. Boyd Grigsby. Boyd Grigsby. He is our only direct witness to the willful nature of the trespass. He is also, at this moment, the man Harlan Ridgway is most likely to make disappear. We need to reach him before they do. Merritt, Maggie said, and she looked out the kitchen window at the frost coming down again over the pasture. I'll reach him. Mrs. Ellsworth, that is not... I said I'll reach him. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table for a long moment. Then she picked up the leather notebook and she turned to the entry Silas had described about the Silver Anchor Tavern, and she read it through carefully. She thought about who Boyd Grigsby was. She thought about the men who drank at the Silver Anchor. She thought about the kind of man who was handed a doctored map and $45,000 and told to look the other way. And she thought about the kind of man who came home at night to a wife and 3 children. She stood up. She fetched her canvas hat and her wool coat. She walked out to the pickup truck and she got in and she drove south on Interstate 5 toward Salem. By the time she pulled into the parking lot of the 3rd motel on her list, the light was already going out of the sky and the flat yellow letters of the Motel 6 sign were coming on above her against the dark. She parked. She got out. She walked into the small linoleum-floored lobby and she asked the tired young woman behind the desk if a Mr. Boyd Grigsby had checked in during the past 4 days. "Ma'am, I'm not allowed to." Maggie set 5 $20 bills on the counter. The young woman looked at the bills. She looked at Maggie. She looked at the bills again. "Room 114, she said, "around the back." Maggie thanked her. She walked out of the lobby and around the back of the building, and she stood in front of the door of room 114 in the deepening November cold, and she raised her hand, and she knocked 3 times. She heard from inside the sound of a man moving very slowly toward the door. The chain slid off. The deadbolt turned. The door opened 4 inches. Boyd Grigsby, unshaven, wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants. His eyes hollow with 2 days of no sleep, looked out through the crack at the 72-year-old woman standing on the concrete walkway in front of his motel room door with the collar of her wool coat turned up against the wind. For a long moment, neither one of them said anything. Then Maggie Ellsworth spoke. "Mr. Grigsby, my name is Margaret Ellsworth. I believe you already know who I am." Boyd stared at her. "May I come inside, Mr. Grigsby? We have some things to discuss. About your wife, about your children, and about a man named Harlan Ridgway, who is going to feed you to a federal prosecutor by the end of this week if you do not sit down with me tonight and tell me the truth." Boyd Grigsby stood in the doorway of room 114 for what felt to him like a very long time. Then he opened the door and he stepped aside and he let her in. The winter came down hard on the Willamette Valley that year. By the middle of December, there was snow on the ridge above the Ellsworth farm for the first time in a decade, and the 12 acres of the southern block lay under a white sheet that hid mercifully the churned black earth and the tangled slash piles of what had once been the finest heritage orchard west of the Mississippi. Maggie stood at the kitchen window on many of those mornings with her mug of coffee, and she looked out at that white sheet, and she thought that the snow was doing for her in some small way. What she had not yet been able to do for herself, it was covering the wound so that the healing could begin. The wound would not heal quickly. The trial was set for March the 12th in the Marion County Courthouse in Salem before the Honorable Cordelia Wexford, a 62-year-old jurist with a reputation well earned across 28 years on the bench for despising corporate perjury and for running her courtroom the way a good farmer runs a fence line straight level and without a single sagging wire. In the weeks before the trial, Merritt Ainsworth came down from Portland twice a week. He and Maggie sat at the kitchen table for hours going over deposition transcripts, exhibit lists, expert reports. Dr. Eleanor Ashcombe flew out from Ithaca a second time to review her forensic appraisal and to prepare for cross-examination. She also spent an afternoon in the greenhouse behind the farmhouse tending to the 3 root fragments she had rescued in November. 2 of them were showing new growth. She showed Maggie how to check the moisture, how to adjust the ambient temperature, how to look for the first signs of callousing at the graft union. "Keep them alive, Mrs. Ellsworth," she said. "The trial will be won or lost on paper, but the orchard will be won or lost in this greenhouse." Silas Thornwood signed a second affidavit, longer and more detailed than the first, and he spent an afternoon with Merritt going over exactly what he had seen at the Silver Anchor Tavern and exactly how he would describe it under oath. And Boyd Grigsby. Since the night Maggie had walked into room 114 at the Motel 6 in Salem and had sat across the small round table from him and had spoken to him for 2 hours in a voice that never once raised, had become in the language of criminal procedure a cooperating witness. He had turned over his old pay-as-you-go phone to a federal investigator the next morning. The phone had contained 147 text messages exchanged with Preston Vane over the preceding 6 months, including the message Preston had sent at 7:14 on the morning of October the 24th, which read in full, "Bulldoze the trees. Let the lawyers handle the old bat. Doubling your rate. Wire Friday." The phone had also contained a photograph of the doctored topographical map, time-stamped and geo-tagged, that Preston had handed Boyd in the parking lot that same morning. Boyd was moved along with his wife and 3 children into protective housing outside of Bend for the duration of the pre-trial period. He was scheduled to testify on the 3rd day of the trial. Maggie did not sleep much in those winter months, but she did not despair either. She went about the daily work of the farm, the sheep, the chickens, the raised beds under their cover crops, with the same slow, steady attention that had gotten her through the 4 years since Walter's death. And she found in that work a kind of quiet that she had not expected to find. She spent an hour every evening in the greenhouse with the 3 root fragments, checking on them the way a mother checks on a sleeping child. By the middle of January, all 3 were showing new growth. By the middle of February, Dr. Ashcombe had walked her through the process of making the first grafts. On the coldest nights, she sat by the wood stove with the leather notebook open on her lap, and she wrote out in her careful schoolteacher's hand everything she wanted to say to a jury if she was called to the stand. She rehearsed it under her breath. She revised it. She read it aloud to Silas Thornwood, who listened without comment and then at the end nodded once and said, "That'll do, Maggie, that'll do." The morning of March 12th came in cool and bright with a soft mist rising off the Willamette River as Maggie drove north on Interstate 5 toward Salem. She wore a gray wool suit that Walter had bought her 20 years ago for a wedding they had attended in Portland and that she had not worn since his funeral. Her hair was pinned up neatly beneath a plain felt hat. She carried the leather notebook in her handbag along with a photograph of Walter at 58, the one from above the kitchen sink. The gallery of Judge Wexford's courtroom was packed by the time Maggie arrived. Local farmers had driven in from as far as Corvallis and Eugene. Independent cider brewers had come down from Portland and up from the Rogue Valley. 2 reporters from the Oregonian sat in the front row with notebooks open. Delphine Fairbanks was there in a blue dress with her hair set, and she caught Maggie's eye as Maggie walked down the center aisle, and she gave her a single small nod. Silas Thornwood was there in a suit that fit him poorly and that he had clearly not worn in a great many years. Dr. Eleanor Ashcombe sat behind the plaintiff's table with her leather portfolio on her knees. Preston Vane sat at the defense table with his attorney, a man named Rutherford Kane. Preston looked, Maggie thought, as she walked past him like a man who had not slept in months. His suit still fit, his hair was still combed, but something behind his eyes had gone slack. Harlan Ridgway sat in the second row of the gallery, behind the defense table alone, wearing a charcoal overcoat, watching the proceedings, with the still cold face of a man who was at that moment calculating exactly how much of what was about to happen could still be controlled. Judge Wexford entered at 9 sharp. The bailiff called the court to order. Rutherford Kane for the defense gave the opening statement Merritt had predicted almost word for word. A regrettable mapping error. An honest mistake by a subcontractor. The $15,000 check that had been generously offered on the day of the incident and that had been, in Mr. Kane's words, unreasonably refused by the plaintiff who has chosen to pursue a windfall recovery under a statute that was never intended to apply to an agricultural boundary dispute of this nature. Merritt Ainsworth stood. He walked to the podium slowly. He wore a plain gray suit. He set a single manila folder on the podium, and he did not open it. He spoke for 11 minutes. He told the jury about Walter Ellsworth. He told them about the 19 years Walter had spent crossing hardy, century-old rootstock with a rare, late-blooming cider apple from a monastery orchard in the Loire Valley. He told them about the federal registration certificate in the cedar box in the attic. He told them about the contract Walter had signed with the United States Department of Agriculture 9 years before his death. He told them about Cascade Craft Cider in Seattle and about the $380,000 a year that Maggie Ellsworth would have received for 10 consecutive seasons from the sale of the Ellsworth Crimson Harvest. Then he told them what had happened on the morning of October the 24th. He told them plainly. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. He simply described in the slow, careful voice of a man who had been trying agricultural cases in the state of Oregon for 41 years. What 110 mature apple trees look like when they are pulled out of the ground by an 8-ton hydraulic excavator, and what the fruit sounds like when it bursts against the tracks of a bulldozer. And what a 72-year-old widow does when she comes home from a cardiology appointment in Portland and finds 12 acres of her husband's life's work reduced to a wasteland of torn earth and pulverized sap. When he was finished, he closed the manila folder. He looked at the jury for a long moment. "This case," he said, "is not about a mapping error. It is about a decision made by a man in an Italian suit in an office in Portland to destroy something he could not buy. We intend to prove that decision, and we intend to ask this court to apply the full weight of Oregon Revised Statute 105.810 against the defendants." He sat down. The first 2 days of testimony went to the plaintiff. Delphine Fairbanks was called first. She took the stand in her blue dress, and she described what she had seen through her binoculars on the morning of October the 24th, and then Merritt Ainsworth introduced into evidence the 47 video files she had recorded from her front porch. Judge Wexford ordered them played on the courtroom monitor. The gallery watched in absolute silence as the trees came down. When the clip showing Preston Vane arriving at the property line in his black SUV at 12:15 was played, Preston with his hands on his hips, watching the last of the destruction with a small, satisfied smile that Delphine had captured in high definition. Rutherford Kane rose to object, and Judge Wexford overruled him with a single word. Dr. Eleanor Ashcombe took the stand on the afternoon of the second day. She was on the stand for 4 hours. She walked the jury through her forensic appraisal in the same clipped, precise vocabulary she used with her graduate students at Cornell. She introduced as an exhibit the federal registration certificate from the cedar box and the USDA contract designating the Southern Block a critical agricultural biodiversity site. She explained in language that even the juror who ran the lumber mill in Staten could follow exactly why the destruction of the heritage block was not a matter of firewood, but a matter of federal plant patent law. She explained the Plant Variety Protection Act. She explained the National Clonal Germplasm Repository. She explained why a single mature Ellsworth crimson tree was worth more than the salary of a corporate acquisitions director. Rutherford Kane's cross-examination, which he had clearly prepared with considerable care, did not shake her on a single figure. When she stepped down at the end of the day, she paused at the plaintiff's table long enough to touch Maggie's shoulder, and Maggie looked up at her and gave her a small nod, and Dr. Ashcombe walked out of the courtroom without another word. On the morning of the third day, Merritt Ainsworth called Boyd Grigsby. Boyd was escorted into the courtroom by 2 federal marshals. He wore a clean plaid shirt and dark jeans. He had shaved. He looked, Maggie thought, like a man who had been sleeping again for the first time in a very long while. He walked past the defense table without looking at Preston Vane. He took the oath. He sat down in the witness box. Merritt asked him to describe in his own words what had happened in the parking lot of the Vane and Ridgway field office on the morning of October the 24th. Boyd told them. He described the map Preston had handed him. He described his objection to the map. He described Preston's response about the surveying error and the corrected filing. He described the envelope of cash. He described the promise of 45,000 more wire transferred by Friday. He described the drive to the Southern Block. He described the first tree coming down. Merritt then introduced into evidence Boyd's old pay-as-you-go phone. He called up the message log on the courtroom monitor. He asked Boyd to read the message that had been sent to him from Preston Vane's personal number at 7:14 in the morning on October the 24th. Boyd read it aloud. The gallery of the courtroom did not make a sound. Preston Vane did not move. Rutherford Kane did not object. Merritt then introduced the wire transfer receipt from Preston's personal account to Boyd's business account, dated the following Friday, in the amount of $50,000. He introduced the photograph of the doctored topographical map, with Preston's signature clearly visible on the lower right margin. He introduced Boyd's sworn statement identifying the map as the one he had been handed that morning. By the time Merritt sat down, the courtroom felt to Maggie the way the kitchen had felt on the night she opened the cedar box, as if a very old door had swung open and something long hidden had walked out into the light. Rutherford Kane rose slowly for his cross-examination. He was in it for 40 minutes. He tried with the skill of a corporate defense attorney of considerable experience to shake Boyd on the details of the parking lot conversation. Boyd did not shake. He tried to imply that Boyd had accepted the money, knowing the map was fraudulent, and had therefore participated willingly in the trespass. Boyd agreed that he had, and he told the jury quietly that he had lived with what he had done every day since, and that no amount of money in the state of Oregon was going to give him back the sleep he had lost between October the 25th and the night a 72-year-old widow had knocked on the door of his motel room and had told him he still had a chance to be a father his children could look at. Rutherford Kane sat down. He did not have any further questions. The courtroom was in recess when Merritt Ainsworth leaned over to Maggie at the plaintiff's table and said quietly, "Mrs. Ellsworth, I would like to call you to the stand this afternoon." She looked at him. "You do not have to. Legally, we have what we need. But I believe this jury needs to hear from you. About Walter, about what he built, about what was taken, and about the man who was sitting at that table pretending he made a clerical error." Maggie thought about it for a long moment. She thought about the leather notebook in her handbag. She thought about the words she had rehearsed by the wood stove all through the long winter nights. "Call me," she said. She took the stand at 2:17 in the afternoon. She was on the stand for 1 hour and 48 minutes. She told the jury about the spring morning in 1993 when Walter had brought the first seedling into the kitchen. She told them about the 19 years of failed grafts. She told them about the day the first mature crimson had borne a full harvest. She told them about the July afternoon 4 years ago when she had found Walter in the driveway with the garden hose still in his hand. She told them about the cedar box in the attic and about the letter Walter had written her the March before he died. She told them about Preston Vane and about the 4 visits and about the noise complaints and about the drainage canal. She read to them from the leather notebook the entry she had made on the night Silas Thornwood had come to her kitchen with news of what he had seen at the Silver Anchor Tavern. She described the man on her porch on the night of November the 14th, and she described what she had done with her husband's Winchester. And she looked directly at Harlan Ridgway in the second row of the gallery as she described it. She told the jury at the end about the moment she had come home on the afternoon of October the 24th and had walked to the ridge above the southern block and had looked down. She did not weep on the stand. She had done her weeping in the black soil at the edge of the ridge on the day it had happened, and she had not wept for the trees since. She simply told the jury what she had seen and what she had felt and what she had said to Preston Vane when he had offered her the $15,000 check with a smile that never reached his eyes. She quoted her own words back to the jury. "You did not cut down firewood, Mr. Vane. You trespassed on private property and destroyed a federally registered proprietary botanical genetics bank." Then she folded her hands in her lap and she waited for the cross-examination. Rutherford Kane rose. He looked at Maggie for a long moment. Then he said, "No questions, Your Honor." And he sat down. At the end of the afternoon, Judge Wexford called a 2-day recess to permit the parties to prepare closing arguments. That night at 11:43, a man in a charcoal overcoat walked into the corner suite of a downtown Portland hotel where Preston Vane was staying for the duration of the trial, closed the door behind him and told Preston Vane in a voice as flat and cold as the surface of a frozen lake that he had exactly one option left: Harlan Ridgway had done the math. The federal investigation triggered by Merritt Ainsworth's initial complaint had, in the intervening 4 months, quietly expanded. Investigators from the USDA, the FBI's Portland Field Office, and the Oregon Department of Justice had been working in coordination. Boyd Grigsby's testimony had already established willful trespass. Silas Thornwood's affidavit had established the meeting with the county drainage inspector at the Silver Anchor. And Delbert Cranmer, the drainage inspector, had been arrested on the morning of March 11th, the day before the trial began, on federal bribery charges. Cranmer had within 6 hours agreed to cooperate. Harlan knew none of this for certain, but he could feel it the way a man who has spent 40 years in high finance can feel the ground shifting under his portfolio. The company was going to lose the civil case. The civil judgment was going to be catastrophic. And there was coming behind the civil judgment a federal criminal indictment that was going to reach into every corner of Vane and Ridgway Holdings. The only question left was who was going to take the fall. Harlan sat across from Preston in the hotel suite, and he explained it to him in 3 sentences. Preston, you are going to stand up in that courtroom on Monday morning, and you are going to accept full personal responsibility. You are going to say that you acted alone, that you falsified the map, that you bribed the drainage inspector, that the executive board had no knowledge. In exchange, the company will cover your legal fees for the criminal proceedings, will settle a private severance package on your family, and will not seek recovery against your personal assets. Preston stared at him. Harlan, that is a decade in federal prison. Yes. And if I refuse, then the company will produce documentation showing that you acted alone anyway, and you will do the decade in federal prison without the severance package. Preston, there is no third door. Preston Vane sat in the leather armchair of the hotel suite, and he looked at Harlan Ridgway for a very long time. Then he stood up. He walked to the window. He looked out at the lights of the Willamette River winding through downtown Portland, and he thought about the $2.5 million offer he had made a 72-year-old widow on her porch 2 years ago. And he thought about the small, satisfied smile he had allowed himself on the afternoon of October the 24th. And he thought about the check he had held out to her in the black soil of the southern block, with the $15,000 written on it. He thought about what a decade in federal prison meant. He thought about what Harlan Ridgway was and what he was not, and what he had always been willing to do to men who worked for him when the ground began to shift. At 2:11 in the morning, Preston Vane picked up his phone, and he called the private line of Merritt Ainsworth in Portland. Merritt answered on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep. Preston Vane said, Mr. Ainsworth, my name is Preston Vane. I would like to meet with you and a representative of the United States Attorney's Office before court convenes on Monday morning. I have information regarding Harlan Ridgway and the executive board of Vane and Ridgway Holdings that I believe you will find useful. Merritt was fully awake by the end of the sentence. Mr. Vane, are you represented by counsel at this moment? I am, but I am prepared to waive privilege and to speak on the record in exchange for consideration on sentencing. I will contact the United States Attorney's Office immediately. Do not speak to Mr. Ridgway or to Mr. Kane between now and the meeting. Do you understand? I understand. Mr. Vane, one more thing. Yes. Do not leave your hotel room. Preston Vane hung up the phone. He sat in the leather armchair by the window until dawn. He watched the sky over the Willamette River go from black to charcoal to the first cold blue of a March morning. And he did not sleep, and he did not weep, and he did not move. The meeting took place at 7 in the morning at the United States Attorney's Office on the 12th floor of the Mark O. Hatfield Federal Courthouse in Portland. Preston Vane spoke for 4 hours. He described in detail the executive board meeting in July at which the Phase 3 timeline had been established. He described Harlan Ridgway's instruction that the Ellsworth property be resolved by any necessary means before the end of October. He described the specific dollar figures approved for the bribery of the county drainage inspector. He described a second bribery of a private surveyor in Salem that had produced the doctored topographical map. He described a $180,000 payment routed through a shell company in Delaware. to a personal account controlled by the Honorable Harold Brennan of the Oregon Circuit Court, who had been originally scheduled to preside over the Ellsworth case before Merritt Ainsworth had filed the motion that had forced his recusal in favor of Judge Wexford. The United States Attorney took notes for 4 hours. Preston Vane was placed under arrest at 11:14 that morning on federal charges of wire fraud, mail fraud, bribery of a public official, and conspiracy. He was released on his own recognizance under the terms of the cooperation agreement. At 1:15 that afternoon, federal marshals executed simultaneous arrest warrants at the Portland offices of Vane and Ridgway Holdings, at the Salem residence of the Honorable Harold Brennan, and at the private residence of Harlan Ridgway in the West Hills of Portland. Harlan Ridgway was not at home when the marshals arrived. He was at that moment in the back of a private car headed for the Portland International Airport, where a chartered Gulfstream was being fueled for a departure to a jurisdiction from which the United States had no extradition treaty. He did not reach the airport. Oregon State Police intercepted the car on Interstate 205 at 2:37 in the afternoon. Harlan Ridgway was arrested without incident. He did not speak. The trial resumed on Monday morning, March 18th, in Judge Wexford's courtroom. Rutherford Kane rose at the defense table and, in a voice that was audibly hoarse, informed the court that his client had over the weekend entered into a cooperation agreement with federal authorities and would not be contesting the plaintiff's claims. He requested that the jury be instructed to return a verdict for the plaintiff on the question of liability and asked the court to proceed directly to the assessment of damages. Judge Wexford permitted herself for the first time in the trial the ghost of a smile. She turned to the jury. She instructed them. They filed out at 10:22 in the morning. They filed back in at 1:49 in the afternoon. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman named Charlotte Herrick, who worked as a bookkeeper at a lumber mill in Staten, rose and read the verdict in a clear, steady voice. The jury found the defendants, Vane and Ridgway Holdings and Preston Vane, fully liable for willful and malicious timber trespass under Oregon Revised Statute 105.810. They awarded to the plaintiff, Margaret Ellsworth, the full forensic valuation of damages as testified to by Dr. Eleanor Ashcombe of Cornell University. $4,812,000. Judge Wexford removed her reading glasses. She looked down from the bench at Preston Vane, who was sitting alone at the defense table now with his hands folded on the polished wood, and she said, "The jury, having determined the base value of the destroyed property and having found that the trespass was committed willfully and with malice aforethought, it is the duty of this court, pursuant to Oregon Revised Statute 105.810, to apply the statutory multiplier of 3. She lifted the gavel. Judgment is entered against the defendants in the amount of $14,436,000, plus plaintiff's legal fees in the amount of $1,200,000, and post-judgment interest at the statutory rate. The gavel came down. The courtroom rose. Maggie Ellsworth sat at the plaintiff's table with her hands folded on the leather notebook, and she looked not at the jury and not at Preston Vane and not at the reporters already moving toward the doors of the courtroom, but at the photograph of Walter she had taken out of her handbag and set on the table beside her. Walter, at 58, his hand on the trunk of the first crimson tree. She looked at him for a long moment. She said very quietly, so quietly that only Merritt Ainsworth, sitting beside her, heard it. "Well, old man, we did it." The fallout came fast. Vane and Ridgway Holdings did not have $14 million in liquid assets. The judgment triggered immediate calls on the company's construction loans. Within 30 days, the firm filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The half-built luxury homes of the estates at Oak Haven were abandoned in place, wrapped in Tyvek that flapped in the spring rains, and the construction cranes stood silent against the Oregon sky. Preston Vane pleaded guilty in July to federal charges of wire fraud, mail fraud, and bribery of a public official and was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison at a facility in Sheridan, Oregon, with the possibility of parole after 4 years contingent upon continued cooperation. Harlan Ridgway was convicted at trial in October on 12 federal counts, including wire fraud mail, fraud bribery of a federal judicial official, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 14 years at a federal facility in Terminal Island. The Honorable Harold Brennan was removed from the bench by unanimous vote of the Oregon Judicial Fitness Commission. He was convicted of accepting a bribe from a corporate developer and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Delbert Cranmer, the county drainage inspector, received 2 years in exchange for his cooperation. Boyd Grigsby, who had cooperated from the beginning, received no prison time. His equipment company folded within 6 months, but he found work with a small excavation firm in Bend that had heard about his testimony and had decided, as the owner put it in a phone call to Maggie a year later, that a man who had stood up in a Marion County courtroom and told the truth was exactly the kind of man he wanted operating his machines. Maggie Ellsworth did not go to a beach house in Carmel. She did not travel the world. She used the settlement money once the appeals had been exhausted and the funds had cleared to purchase at bankruptcy auction the 300 acres of former dairy pasture that had been the site of the estates at Oak Haven. She paid for the entire parcel less than a fifth of what Preston Vane had originally been prepared to spend on Phase 3 alone. She hired crews to tear down the half-built mansions. She had the foundations broken up and hauled away. She had the freshly poured asphalt of the private roads ripped out and the gravel bases removed. She had the land regraded to its original contours. And in the greenhouse behind the farmhouse, the greenhouse she had tended every evening through the long winter nights of the trial, the greenhouse where Dr. Eleanor Ashcombe's 3 rescued root fragments had by the spring of the 2nd year become 47 successfully grafted young trees. Maggie now had the beginnings of an orchard that had less than 18 months earlier been declared extinct. Dr. Ashcombe returned from Cornell to oversee the propagation. In partnership with Oregon State University's Department of Horticulture, Maggie established the Walter Ellsworth Agricultural Trust, a permanent non-profit endowment charged with preserving heirloom apple cultivars and expanding the National Clonal Germplasm Repository's holdings in the Pacific Northwest. Where the estates at Oak Haven were supposed to have stood, Maggie planted over the course of the next 3 growing seasons 10,000 new rare apple trees, Arkansas blacks, Huey's crabs, Roxbury russets, Newtown pippins, 22 other rare heritage cultivars whose bloodlines Walter had catalogued in his ledgers over 40 years. And at the center of the new orchard, on the highest ground overlooking the creek where Walter's ashes had been scattered, she planted one by one the propagated descendants of the original Ellsworth crimson. 110 trees, the same number that had been destroyed. She planted them herself one every morning through the spring of the 3rd year in the gray dawn light with her canvas hat pulled low and Silas Thornwood standing beside her with a shovel. She did not speak while she planted them. She did not need to. On the morning the last one went in a small whip of grafted wood, no bigger than a soda straw, resting on a folded square of green flannel. Just as the first seedling had rested on the kitchen table 32 years before, Maggie stood back, and she looked at the long, careful rows of new trees stretching down the slope in the soft April light, and she reached up, and she took off Walter's canvas hat, and she held it against her chest. Silas Thornwood stood beside her. He removed his own hat. Neither one of them said anything for a long time. Then Maggie spoke very softly into the wind coming down off the Cascades that morning. "Walter, you built this. I just kept it standing." The wind carried her words up the slope and into the branches of the young trees, and the leaves whispered the way orchard leaves always whisper in the Willamette Valley in the springtime and somewhere down in the low ground by the creek. A red-winged blackbird called out, once sharp and clear, and Maggie Ellsworth, 74 years old, her spine as straight as a fence post, her hands calloused from a lifetime of pruning shears, and now again, from the grafting knife, put Walter's canvas hat back on her head. She turned. She walked back up the slope toward the farmhouse, and behind her, in the soft new soil of the reclaimed land, 10,000 young trees stood in their careful rows in the morning light. A living monument to a promise made in a gravel driveway 4 years too late and kept in the end exactly the way a good farmer keeps a fence line. Straight, level, and without a single sagging wire.